you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today on this hopefully interesting webinar. Vesna introduced a bit that today we'll have the pleasure to speak with one expert on the field of physical well-being, but that has as well an extensive experience working and collaborating with Barnahus services. This is the third series of webinars that we are having on exploring more safeguarding related issues in the different contexts of Barnahus. We have been following the example or the model of 4 rooms. And so far we have explored safeguarding in the context of child protection room and as well a mental well-being room, while today we'll be focusing on the physical well-being room. And we have as well another webinar that will be exploring safeguarding within the forensic interviewing room. The format of the conversation today or the webinar, it will be in a form of an interview, while myself, I will be addressing some questions to Dr. Andrea, and she will be answering to those questions, of course. And at the end of the conversation, you will have the opportunity as well for you to share questions on the chat with us. Just before I give the virtual mic to Andrea, I would like to come back again to the definitions somehow that we have been using in regarding to safeguarding, that with safeguarding, we understand all the measures that organizations and institutions put in place in order to make sure that their operations, staff, and activities do not harm to beneficiaries. This includes the prevention part, but as well the response. And exactly this will be exploring a bit with Dr. Andrea on how we can make sure that children are safeguarded while are going into the physical well-being room and receiving different services. Let's start with Dr. Andrea. If you can make a short introduction of yourself and your experience.
Thank you very much, Vesna and Alketa. So my name is Andrea Goddard, as you both said. I am a pediatrician based in London. I have actually retired, but I was involved with the Promise network more or less from the beginning. And I found it to be a really great experience. So I continued to do a little bit of teaching, but I'm probably about to retire from that as well. But anyway, so I was a pediatrician in London until last year. And part of my job, and I know the role of a pediatrician and actually the type of doctor that is involved in examining children when there's an allegation of particularly sexual abuse, but sometimes physical abuse as well. In the UK, it tends to be since about 2000 well, no, for a long time, it's tended to always be a pediatrician. I know in some countries it's more like a gynecologist. One of the problems that we would have with that is that a lot of the children who come and see us are not girls, so they're actually young boys. So we have always tended to keep it in the pediatric domain. Just to explain a bit more about myself, so I was involved with child safeguarding and child protection for about the last 20 years. There have been lots and lots of changes in our system and probably in yours too in those 20 years. And I particularly became involved in the examination of children after sexual or concerns about sexual abuse about 20 years ago. In London, we have made a huge amount of progress with that. Initially, it used to be not very well coordinated. Children often had to wait a long time, often in an accident or emergency department in a hospital. They had to wait for a specialist forensic pediatrician to be found somewhere and come to them, and that could take many hours. And then from about 2004 onwards, we had a specialist service within in our case, it's within our adult sexual assault examination specialist service, which for me was called the Haven. So the idea of the Haven being that a person has had the terrible experience of a sexual assault, and so they come to the Haven where all of their needs are met. So it's not only there for physical examination, it's for support and follow-on mental health support. I know we're in the physical health room today, but just to say that in our centre, as in many Barnahus, it's not a separate issue. And actually in our Haven, we could also do the forensic examination, but only recently, thanks to our involvement with Barnahus, we became able to have child psychologists doing our forensic interviews as well, whereas previously it had been the police. So I've probably given you way too much information there, but basically I'm a pediatrician who for about 20 years has been involved in child protection, physical examinations, including those for children who have either disclosed or where there are concerns about possible sexual abuse.
Thank you, Andrea. Can you elaborate a bit more? You already started a bit to elaborate what are some of the services that are being taking place in the physical well-being room within the concept of Barnahus. Maybe to start, like to explain a bit the procedures and the services who are performed there.
So we work very closely with our colleagues in Children's Social Services and the police. For children, the particular situation in England is that if you're a child under 13 years and you disclose or someone has concerns that you're being sexually abused, that disclosure should be something that where the police, social services and health colleagues work together. So in our service, we were usually contacted in that age group by either social services or the police. And then our conversation with them was to make a plan for how we were going to manage this particular child and this particular situation. And what our role was normally was to see the child, do an examination, which we stressed to our colleagues. One, was not an unpleasant examination. Two, was not just an examination of the genital area. We wanted to look at the whole child because there are other issues that might need to be addressed in relation to the child's health. So normally the conversation with the social services and police would lead to a plan for us to examine the child, basically. We would make sure with our colleagues that it was, were there any other children at risk in the household or in the school or institution? Just, they probably had thought of that, but just to remind them. And also we would need the details in our situation of from the police and or social services about what had happened, when it had happened, and what had they done about it so far. That I can talk about that a little bit later, but it helped us arrange what we needed to do. So as I said, our service, we could do, just to differentiate, the forensic examination is where we're hoping to get some DNA particularly. So it has to be done fairly quickly after the child says they've been assaulted. So if the child said it was a month ago, we know we're not going to find any DNA. So we could arrange that examination when it was a good time for the child and the family, and it would not be in the middle of the night, say. So that one we would do in normal hours, in the daytime, we would see the child. If the child says it was last night, we would try to see that child quite quickly and do a slightly different form of examination where we took all the DNA swabs for analysis by the police. In our case, that's by the police. And so that might be that we would We tried not to see children at, 2 in the morning, but we would often see them first thing in the morning, just so that we had a better chance of getting that DNA from as well. So the timing was one consideration. And that was usually, as I said, a conversation with police, social services, doctors in our service to sort that out. So that was our first point of contact.
You started to explain a bit about the forensic examination and the important elements to take into account. And I would like just to go a bit backwards on what you mentioned in terms of the profile of the physician who needs to perform the forensic examination. Can you share with us what are some key elements to consider for a physician exploring, like in charge for forensic examination, and if there is a difference with other physicians that need to do other procedures?
That's a really good question, Alkesha. And I know the setup is slightly different in different services. In our service, so we were very aware that a lot of people don't have a good understanding or a particular pediatric experience in terms of their approach to the child, and also to some extent in terms, to be way more specific, in terms of the appearance of the particularly female genitalia before puberty. There's lots of doctors know exactly what an adult female should look like, but a lot of people do not know what a young girl should look like, or what are the variations in normal appearance. So we had, for our forensic examinations, we had a forensic trained doctor who would make sure that all the right samples were taken and dealt with appropriately. But at the same time, we also had a pediatrician. So we had two doctors, and we usually had another support person who, in our case, was called a crisis worker. They most often had a nursing background. So for our forensic examinations, there would be those 3 people involved in the examination of the child. For our non-forensics, where we weren't trying to take forensic swabs, we were just examining the child, we would normally have a pediatrician who was specially trained and supported to examine children who might have been special sexual assaulted, plus a support person in the room as well, who, in our case, we had the title we gave to our support person was a child family advocate, and we usually had someone the child knew to support them, who was most often the mother, but didn't have to be the mother. I mean, occasionally the mother was actually the alleged perpetrator, so it will be someone who could support the child. So we would have 3 people in the room examining the child in that situation.
And how, like, I'm a psychologist by background, so, and I was interested to know how you make sure that the child is safe during this process. I mean, psychological safety and physical safety. I guess it is important, considering that for a victim or survivor, it is a quite traumatic experience going through this process.
And that's another great question, Alkesha. So, because what we knew, or our experience with our colleagues in both police and social services, is that they often had the belief that examining a child was going to be a terrible experience for the child. And a lot of people, especially for girls, think it's going to be exactly like the sort of, female gynecological examination. And they thought it would be an internal examination. So they were often a bit reluctant to even consider examination. However, we don't do any of those things. What we do is we, as I said, set it up so that it's at a good time for the child as much as possible and the parental carer. We take it really, really slowly, and we try to have a nice physical environment. And I know all of the Barnahus I've seen have had a really nice waiting area with toys and stuff that says, this is a nice place for you to be, for the child and the parent. And then one of us, and it was usually our family advocate, would sit down with the child and usually the parent, and really, really slowly explain exactly what we were going to do. And also, really importantly, explain that we were not going to do anything unless the child was happy to go ahead. So we would never force a child to be examined. And we also really carefully explained that if they didn't like, just because they said yes, they would let us examine them at the beginning, didn't mean they couldn't say stop. Anytime they said stop, we would stop. So we took it really slowly. We made the environment really welcoming. We did lots and lots of explanation about, and saying what we were going to do. And we were very clear that the child could stop, didn't have to start, and could stop at any time if they did start. So that was our kind of that was before we even started an examination. When we did the examination, as I said, we didn't have too many people in the room. And I say this particularly because some of the centres that I've visited, there is a kind of feeling that you need the social worker and the police officer, for example, or a couple of them need to all be in the room to be part of this examination. So we have never thought that was helpful. In fact, it's very overwhelming to be examined with 10 people standing around staring at you. So we had a very small number of people in the room, particularly as as I said, most doctors and even pediatricians are not particularly clear about what things should look like. So what is the point of having a police officer staring at an examination? I think everyone thinks it's all going to be, usually the findings we find are very, very subtle. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself. With our examination, so having explained, got consent, said you can stop, we then took the child usually into the examination room, showed them around, showed them the equipment, let them kind of, get accustomed to it. Did really familiar things for children, like taking their weight and their height. Explained to them that we were just going to examine them bit by bit, but we were going to try and look from top to toe. And so we start off, maybe having a look at their hands, listening to their chest with a stethoscope, because most of them will have been to the doctor and that will have happened. So they'll be quite familiar with that. And then in the end, we would then look very gently and trying to maintain their modesty as much as possible, we would look at their genital area. And to go back to the point, we don't use any gynecological instruments. We merely have a look from the outside. And what we're looking for are things like, in forensic terminology, they're lacerations, but they're cuts or grazes or bruises, and just also looking to see if the child is otherwise normal or not. Because a lot of people do not understand what a young girl should look like. So they have a whole idea, for example, the key misunderstanding is that there is a thing called a hymen, and the hymen is what is called intact until, that whoever, the virginity is lost. So these ideas are very fixed in the mind of many, many people. In fact, unless there's something wrong, which is actually quite rare, there is always an opening in the hymen. Otherwise, when girls start having periods, there's no way the blood can come out. So there is always an opening, and the appearance can be very, very variable. So that's why, it is helpful to have people with expertise in normal appearances and abnormal appearances, but also to be able to see things like bruises or grazes or cuts or anything like that around not only the female genitalia, but also around the bottom, the anus, and also for boys, obviously, they can have the same sorts of things on their penis or around their genital area. So, but we did all that. By the time we got to that point, we kind of established confidence with the child, and usually the mothers, if they're with the mother, they're often really, really nervous as well. So we kind of very, very slowly got to that point. And as I said, if they didn't like it, we said, fine, that's okay. So we didn't force them. So that was all. And then when we'd finished the examination, we actually usually made them hot chocolate and gave them a biscuit or something like that, and then sat down and explained what we'd found and what would be the next step. And actually, the most common thing we find is everything is normal. And so we really reassure everyone that in that case, that the child looks normal, or if there's a bruise or a graze, we reassure the child and say the mother that it's all going to heal up really quickly, because the whole area does heal up really quickly, and that they're otherwise completely normal. Because actually, again, a lot of parents, if their child says they've been sexually assaulted, they have all sorts of fears about not only the appearance, but is their daughter ever going to be able to have babies or things like that. There are lots of thoughts that crowd into the stressed parent's mind when they find out about sexual abuse, so that we try to address all those fears as well. So with all of that, we hope that we've provided certainly a safe environment, and we hope that it was clear quite often that actually providing that reassurance was really helpful. I mean, you could say, I would say that, wouldn't I? But actually, you could just see the parents relax. The child often didn't have any idea that they were damaged forevermore, but the mother often did. So once you say everything's fine, everything will be fine, you can just see the parents start to relax. I mean, they've got a lot more stress to deal with, but that was one thing that we could reassure them about, which is good. And we would then go on to explain about our other services, which would be supporting them through any processes like medico-legal processes that were going to happen through, and also explain what we could do in terms of then addressing the mental health issues that might arise. So that was our kind of whole interaction. Oh, I forgot one thing.
Go ahead.
So I've talked mainly about, we particularly saw the prepubertal stroke under 13-year-olds. Once you get to puberty, there is very specific medical needs that you might have if you're a girl or a boy after sexual assault. And so we have to address those as well. And also they are things that often worry the parents a lot as well. So there's HIV, and sometimes if we think there's a high risk kind of assault that's happened, we have to provide the medication called PEP or Pepsi, and we have to monitor that. So we need to organize that. There are sexually transmitted infections. Again, you can't always pick them up straight away. They take 10 to 14 days to show up, so that you have to then arrange to see the child again. And that is both older and younger children. And for post-pubertal girls, there's obviously pregnancy. So we have to discuss the risks of that and offer any morning after pill type contraception if that's what they want. So there are those real medical needs that need to be addressed as well.
Thank you. You mentioned a bit and quite detailed actually the procedures and the process, how it happens. But can you describe what can be some of the risks that can be related with safeguarding or making sure that children are safe during the whole process, that can be encountered or are encountered during the forensic evaluation, but not only, even during another assessment for suspicions of abuse? Maybe for the colleagues who are working on this specifically, it will be interesting to point out some of the risks that you are aware of.
So I think the two things that occur to me when you ask me this question, occasionally we are so there is a child and a parent who's not alleged to be the perpetrator, but the parent doesn't believe the child, and they make that clear, and that is very distressing. and the sort of typical situation is a child and the mum maybe has a new boyfriend, and the new boyfriend is said to be sexually abusing the child, and the child says to the mother, your new boyfriend is, you know, touching me or putting his fingers into my bottom or whatever. And then the mother, and I have been in the room when this happened, the mother clearly doesn't believe the child, and so keeps saying to us, oh, she's lying, she's exaggerating. So that is really a very, we can just, you know, we will obviously then discuss that not only with our colleagues, but also with social services, because that's a terrible situation for a child to be in. So that's one. I did say I had two, but it's gone out of my head. So that's, oh no, I know the other one. The other thing is that sometimes the parents get very angry because instead of being reassured by the fact that everything is normal, they have come along with a belief that sometimes, I have to say, the police and or social services have not, they may have exaggerated. They have a belief that if we examine a child, we know exactly what has happened. So so we have to be very clear that we do not know what happened. The child's word is there if the child can talk, or and often there can be a suspicion or a concern, which is why we're examining the child. But if the child has disclosed, like the child I mentioned saying her mother's boyfriend is putting his fingers in her bottom or his bottom, then that child's word seems to not be held as, you know, enough. But at the same time, we should examine to make sure there is nothing there. But if we find nothing, sometimes the parent gets angry and says, why did this child have to go through this examination? You can't even tell me what happened. And they feel very distressed by it. So that's another not great situation, because that, I think it means we probably haven't explained well enough. But I think for some parents, they have this belief that, you know, once something like that has happened to the child is smart. But it slightly relates back to this idea that many cultures have, which is that you can tell someone who's a virgin or not a virgin, which is completely wrong. So there's some idea in many people's minds that if something sexual happens, there is something that will be clear to the world forevermore. So that's another, the parental anger and disappointment. And you know that it means that they are going to have more trouble perhaps supporting their child through this. So what else can I think of? They're the main ones that are not uncommon, actually. Is that what you were thinking of? Okay.
Yes, yes, sure. I was just thinking for another question while we were speaking now. You mentioned a bit the collaboration that you had, the good collaboration with other, like the social services and police. I'm just thinking that not in every country it is present, this good collaboration between like these key players and key professionals. And maybe it might be challenging for a physician, and I know from my professional experience as well, when, for instance, they are the physicians and they don't find enough proof during the forensic examinations. Sometimes they have confrontations not only with the parents, but even with the police or law enforcement officials. I don't know if you have encountered a similar case, not maybe when you had some disagreements with colleagues, and how you have handled this, and considering the fact that not as well in some countries may not be as good this collaboration.
Okay, sure. So in England, it's slightly, when I say England and not the UK, it's just because the law is slightly different. It's usually England plus Wales, similar. Scotland is a bit different, and Northern Ireland a bit different. There is a legal obligation for those three services to cooperate in this domain. So no one, that's not a big issue. I know in many countries, and I think because we have a national health system, because In fact, the health system in many ways led, particularly they led the improvement of services for children and adults after sexual assault. So we've always had pretty good cooperation, and actually it is a legal obligation for us all to cooperate. So we can't not cooperate. But it's true that sometimes the police, who are kind of quite focused on the evidence, they don't get angry, they just look a little bit disappointed when we say the examination was normal, or that we've taken swabs but we couldn't find any evidence of any physical damage. And there are, I mean, just to explain that, a lot of children are actually, what they disclose is more like, you know, what we call digital penetration or touching the genitalia, all of which are sexual offences, but it's not necessarily a whole, you know, a violent assault. And also this idea of grooming, so things happen slowly over time. And so often with that, you don't see any kind of sign of any physical trauma. And second, as I said, even if there had been trauma a couple of days ago, things heal up really, really quickly. So that often, if it's more than a few days or weeks, whatever was there, we can't see anymore. And we can't tell it was there. So it's not as though if there was a bruise there, we know by looking now that it was there a few weeks ago. So for that reason, often, by far, and this is a worldwide observation, it depends a bit, but it's certainly less than 10%, and it's probably less than about 5% of children examined after disclosing sexual assault. Is there any abnormal finding? Which is quite a small number, but I don't think, especially our colleagues at police, they often do, as I said, look a tiny bit disappointed because they'd like some evidence. I mean, it's all part of their job. So, but we don't usually have arguments. No. Which is good. I mean, it's nice. The other thing to say is I know in many countries, actually getting hold of a doctor isn't quite as easy, where you don't have a sort of national health system. You kind of have many, many doctors in the private health system. Quite hard to persuade them that this is something that would be a helpful thing to do. So I was aware of that when I was involved more with the Promise 1 and 2 network. Although I think that is, on the other hand, in many countries, there seem to be fabulous people who were doing exactly the same thing as we were doing and offering really sensitive, kind, gentle examinations for children in these circumstances.
Andrea, you mentioned a bit, and I think it is important to go back a bit to the fact that on the gender issue, especially when it comes to the victims and survivors, as usually it is perceived that it should be a profile of a gynecologist, and it is mostly perceived that girls or females are more victims. Or would you have any specific reflection on this, that is, and to share it with the colleagues who are listening to us?
In our service, which I said was largely around under 13s, we actually had quite a high proportion of boys. There is quite a lot of sexual abuse of young boys, as I'm sure many people are aware. So our whole service was open to all age groups, all male, female, and any other gender. And actually we saw quite a lot of boys. I would say, I can't remember the number, we're just about to do a little study, but it's sort of 30–40%, something quite high. And that is because boys are sexually abused quite often. I think for older boys, it can be more difficult to disclose. So I know in our older, in our adolescent group, the number of boys, so let's say 13 to 18, is a much smaller number, but under 13, it was not infrequent that we were seeing a boy, not a girl.
Andrea, what will be some of tips or recommendations that you will give to the younger generation? You have such a rich experience. What you will recommend for someone that is younger and it is doing the working on the physical aspect? What will be some of the recommendations from your experience?
So lots of what I would say is that it's not something anyone should do in isolation. You do need what we call peer support. So we had across London, say, all of the pediatricians involved in doing this work, and say there are about, I don't know, not that many actually, say 30-ish. We would have regular meetings. We were always, there were lots of people you could, if you had a query or a worry, you could always ring up a colleague and discuss it with them. So you need to actually not just think, okay, I am going to go and do this, but more to set up a network of people who can support each other. Because it is, it is quite, there's no doubt it's potentially very challenging work, not only emotionally, but also it is quite hard sometimes to work out exactly what is going on when you're looking at this child, because there is such a lot of variation. There's quite a bit of potential disagreement. And so you need that. And the other thing that is very helpful in this domain, which I haven't mentioned, but one of the things that we do to avoid any child having to be examined repeatedly is with the consent of the child and the carer, we take a video recording of any specific findings, including any genital findings. And so obviously people get very worried about their child's genitals being part of a video recording. So we have very tight security around that not being, it's actually not on an internet, we actually record them on old-fashioned DVDs and we store them extremely securely as part of the child's medical record, not something we give to the police. And the only person who can look at that would be, say, if this case goes to court, normally there would be our evidence, and also, but a defense expert might want to come and, examine the evidence. So that's the only other person who would be another medical person who would be able to look at that. So in that way, we avoid the child being endlessly examined by other people, which is extremely important. And we, hang on, I forget what the first part of your question was. I'm straight off topic.
Oh, you are on the recommendations. So you were sharing the recommendations for professionals. Yeah.
Okay, so the other advantage about DVD recordings is that with the consent of the child and the carer, we can use those to help educate younger people coming into the area. And also when we've got cases that are difficult or tricky, we actually, in this little group that meets regularly, we can sort of show them and discuss them and learn from them, and that's very helpful as well, because it is quite tricky in that respect. So I think you need emotional support, but you also need that kind of educational expertise support as well. And I mean, London's really big, so having 30 people is great in lots of ways, and lots of places are way smaller than that. But you need at least a couple of you to be able to learn together and support each other, I would say. And also, you can't be on call 24/7, so you need a few people in the system anyway.
And you, Andrea, I'm curious to know, you mentioned a bit that this is, and we have all the assumption that it is a quite a stressful profession, and especially you are faced with emotionally and psychologically overwhelming sometimes. what will be some tips or recommendations that you will give to professionals working on performing a forensic examination, how to protect themselves and their psychological and emotional well-being? You already mentioned the peer-to-peer support, that is good, but what else? Or either from your personal experience, what has been useful for you while working so long on this profession?
Actually, in our service, we had, I have to say, quite a lot of psychologists, and we had a weekly meeting with the whole team, including our psychologists as well. And actually, that was really helpful because everyone could, some cases are very, very distressing. So actually, to be able to discuss it together was helpful. I mean, some cases are just really distressing. They're all a bit distressing, but some of them are really distressing. So I think one of the things that is good to reflect on with your colleagues is actually, it is something, the service that you do is actually, in the vast majority of cases, has helped the child and the carer. So you actually are, most people want to be doctors or nurses because they want to help people. So you're definitely helping people. Our psychologists were really good at helping us think about it. So if in your service you have regular meetings with your psychologists and the whole team, I think that provides lots of support as well. And obviously, if it's really getting to people, usually there are other support services, or maybe if it's not going to be something that everyone wants or should be doing. So you probably have to recognize that as well, without feeling that that's a terrible thing. It is quite a tough area emotionally. There's
Yes.
no easy answer to that one.
Well, I think this was helpful as well to share it. Okay, so those were the questions that I had thought to discuss with you today, Andrea. I don't know if you have any particular thing that you would like to add, or before I give the floor to the participants, if they have any specific question.
No, I think we've covered most of the things I would normally like to say. I may have forgotten some, but I hope I haven't. Maybe that will come up in some questions anyway. So no, okay.
Okay, so for the other is in the audience, feel free to ask your question if you want to unmute yourself or to write it in the chat box. I saw that Desna already wrote it.
Yes.
So
if you want also to open a microphone, there is possibility, so really feel free to jump in.
Maybe to start with a short presentation of yourself, it will be helpful as well for us.
I see that Kate has opened a microphone, so if you have any question or comment, feel free.
Hi everyone, Dr. Goddard, thank you so much. That was really illuminating. I'm from the Irish government. We're currently trying to set up a Barnahus service here. We have one, but we're hoping to expand to 3 other centres nationally. And I was really interested when you were talking about the specialists required, because obviously from a forensic point of view, as you say, there's a high level of specialty for the paediatricians. In your service, how many or was there any tool that you used to determine how many specialists would be required, or was that something that kind of was figured out over time?
That's a really great question. Actually, so because we have a whole adult service, and a little subset of that is the under 13 service. And the adult service, when I say adult, they see the adolescents as well. I know there is always, and we have a 24/7 service because of the forensic nature of that adult service, but also for the children where it's indicated. So we therefore have to run a 24/7 rota. I know it's always a big challenge. We're basically on 3 sites in London currently. I could find out for you how many people we have. I know it can be really tough to man that rota. Yeah, but in terms of, so we in our service for the out of hours rota, we had about, I don't know, 10 or so pediatricians. It became quite hard to find people. I mean, there was this is why I think training and making it slightly less of a mystery service is really important. But just having enough pediatricians not to be on call every single night, because that's not possible. But at the same time, you know, having a kind of pool of expertise, because it's also good for your peer support mechanism to have. I don't know. I don't know how big Dublin, or I know I've been to the Galway Centre, but I don't know. I think but it's going to be a challenge. That's what I would say to you. But if
Yes.
you wanted to find out how many we have based on our numbers seen, I could get those numbers for you.
That would be, I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
If you email me, it's Kate, is it?
Yes, I will do.
Okay, so I can find that out. I know that we currently have a sort of voluntary out of hours rota, and to explain those doctors are not necessarily working at our service in the daytime, but they do so you need a kind of core people in the daytime and then a bigger team of people who can do the out of hours. They also, by the way, come from the ones who are examining adults and not under 13-year-old children, come from quite a wide range of backgrounds. So they're GPs, or they are often gynae, GP. They're the biggest groups, but they can be any kind of medical background. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I just see that your email has been very helpfully sent over, so I'll email you. Thank you so much.
If you email me, I can easily find out our equation for numbers and cases.
That would be so great. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kate. Any other question? I see we have a comment from Maria Vidal saying, thank you, Dr. Andrea, for sharing such important tips.
Thank you, Maria.
And again, just maybe to the colleagues, think the webinar it is recorded and will be as well uploaded in the Child Hub platform. And if you would like to share it with other colleagues, will be more than helpful to share it. I have another question for you, Andrea, as you mentioned a bit the trainings. And I'm personally involved in some countries that would like to set up a Barnahus. What you would consider from your experience and as an expert for Promise as well, some of the trainings topics that you will refer for the new physicians that will be engaged in new countries that they are just starting. So what will be the most important trainings that you will recommend?
So it's a great question. I mean, obviously, and presumably these people are going to have, I think for examining children, having a pediatric background is important. Then you need to make sure this is being strictly medical about it. They need to understand the anatomy, and particularly the prepubertal anatomy of a child. They need to have some knowledge, but not necessarily. The service needs to have a protocol for provision of the specific medical things that I mentioned. That's HIV prophylaxis, sexually transmitted infection, and any risk of pregnancy. So that's strict medical stuff. In the training session that we ran at our service, but also some of the ones I gave in person in Port Promise, we actually, myself and a colleague, For example, we actually we more or less ran a mini peer support meeting with the videos I'm suggesting. So we kind of went through all that stuff with them, because it is a different area from most pediatric training experiences. And then obviously you need to understand the safeguarding system, how that works in your setting, who your colleagues are, what your obligations are in that sort of context. We have to write lots of reports, so we write a report. We may have to go to court to give evidence, so you need some idea of what that may involve in your setting, and you know, not only how to do it, but most doctors hate going to court, so you need a bit of support around that as well. What else did we do? So the main things were the totally, you know, the medical bit, a bit about the service and the safeguarding context you're working in, including the medico-legal context and what that might mean for you as a pediatrician. There's probably more, but they're the key ones I want to.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. So Susanna is saying that I'm curious, what do you think about how to ensure children's right to be heard during the physical examination? In some countries, they have strict rules about the age of consent, so 15 to 16 as a patient. How to deal with that in practice?
That is a great question, actually. And that I know that is a really difficult area where you can have a situation. So just to explain, in England, as long as you're mentally able to consent, there is no lower age limit, which I know seems extraordinary. But it's usually around, say, for a child, it depends, and it's depending on what you're consenting for. So if we had say a 15 or a 14-year-old who said, right, I would like to have this examination because I want to, you know, I want to make sure everything is okay, they could consent to that even if their parent was right there saying, I do not want my child to have this examination. Because if you, and I know that that isn't the case in every country, and it is difficult because you get into the situation where you could even have parents colluding to prevent their, you know, where one of them was a perpetrator, colluding to prevent their child from being examined. There is no easy answer to this. But I think if we have any issues over consent, we have a mechanism whereby in the end that can go to a court and the judge can rule on it. I don't know if you have those as well. Because I think, I mean, the problem with sexual assault is that time can be really important. But on the other hand, if you cannot examine anyone without consent, that's the bottom line. And if that consent has to come from a parent and you don't get it, then you might have to consider, you know, recourse to the courts to argue the case. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get it, but at least I hope there's a mechanism whereby you can do that. But it is a really tricky one. And sorry, no easy answer.
Thank you. Any other question? I don't see a question. I see as well a comment from Kete Vani. Okay, now I see the question. Let me, Maria. Okay, so may I ask you how the justice system interacts with Dr. Andrea's forensic team concerning proof production in medical and psychological assessments, especially the prosecution and the judge? Do they seek information, ask to be present in the interview? So if you can touch a bit on that.
Okay, so thank you for that question. I think one of the key things is that the way the legal system operates in England is very different from the way it operates in most of the rest of Europe. So I know, in fact, one of my earliest experiences going to Barnahus in Iceland was that when they have their forensic interview, in fact, the judge, the prosecuting lawyer, and the defense lawyer are all actually there at the time listening to the interview. that is not, we have a different legal system. So what we may be obliged to do as doctors, and I can't answer for our psychologists, I'm sorry. So as I said, we may well have to write what's called a statement that would be given to the police, would ask us to write that. They would be collecting all the evidence available. They would then be sending it to a thing called the Crown Prosecution Service. If it's going to court, our statement would be part of the evidence, and we could be called to give evidence in court. And by doing that, we will be giving evidence to the judge. The defense barrister would normally start off asking us the questions, but then we would be cross-examined by a prosecuting barrister. It's not much fun. So there's that. And as I said before, in terms of the evidence that we have, all our medical notes can be, the police can request those as part of the evidence. And this is where I mentioned we have our DVDs, which are basically videos of the genital examination. We don't disclose those to the police, but we would tell the police that if the defense team want to look at them, they need to identify their own expert and to come and look at them, and we'll arrange that. So that's that bit of the evidence. So to answer your question, A, it's a very different system, but B, we are involved in the way we are meant to be involved in our system. And I don't know, I actually think our system is way more difficult for anyone giving evidence. Another key point that is fantastic about the system as I saw it operate in Iceland was that once that forensic interview is over, that's it. The child can then, it doesn't have to be involved, in the legal process anymore. Unfortunately, in our case, there is a forensic interview which will be recorded. That's part of the evidence, but it doesn't mean that the child can't be asked to be called to court to give evidence, which is can be, it's bad enough for me, an old doctor. It must be terrifying for a child. There are special kind of considerations, like they don't have to be in the court. They can be out in a room where they're on a video link. So there are all sorts of considerations for any vulnerable witness to support them giving evidence. However, they can't say, sorry, I don't want to give evidence. So I think the system in the rest of Europe is way better. And we, unfortunately, if it's a legal process, we don't have a great deal of choice, actually. Because another disadvantage of our system is that the court case can be quite a long time after the actual event. So that means that, the family can't move on from it. They've got, because it's another trauma. I mean, to think about the child's well-being, it's another trauma for the child and the family to actually have this looming on the horizon.
Yeah, true.
2 new messages.
Thank you. So Maria is saying it is similar in Portuguese court. So Maria, it was from Portugal, and yes, children are requested more than once, but yeah, definitely it will be mostly according to the legal system that is in place in the countries. Okay, any other question? No, I don't see any other one. So, well, the questions were very useful as well because they touched upon things that we didn't discuss it before. So hopefully we managed to cover the majority of the core elements of the safeguarding in the physical well-being. If we don't have any other question, I would really like to thank you. And I'm very grateful to you, Andrea, for finding the time and sharing such useful tips. And I do really hope that you'll still be willing to share more in other similar formats, because you are really a resourceful person for Promise, but as well for the professionals working on this field. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alberta, and thank you. It was The questions were great and the comments are very nice. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Vesna?
Okay, bye.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Just the two final notes from the Child Hub. Just thank you, Dr. Andrea. Thank you, Alketa. It was really a pleasure to listen to your conversation. It was really inspiring and really informative, I would say, in the same time. As Alketa said, the recording will be available on the YouTube channel of the Child Hub, and please share it with your professional network and your colleagues. It would be really nice to have it more shares. Like always, please stay in touch with Child Hub newsletter. We still have, Alketa, 2 more webinars, I believe, right, from the Promise Network. So you will see all the dates on the Child Hub network, but also in the newsletter. And the final thing is always like our very short evaluation poll that we have on the Child Hub. So please give us a few seconds just to click it and to give us a feedback. Have a nice rest of the day, and thank you all again for being with us.
Thank you everyone.
Bye.
Bye.